The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and by Wednesday evening, everything Sarah Leland had left in this world was being threatened by a man who had never once done an honest day's work in his life. She stood on the porch of the small homestead outside of Caldwell, Kansas, holding the envelope with both hands while the wind pulled at the edges of her dark skirt. The letter bore the official wax seal of the Hargrove Land and Cattle Company, and the language inside it was polished and cold, the kind of language that men of great wealth used when they wanted to disguise cruelty as legality. It told her in 3 short paragraphs that her land, the 160 acres her late husband Thomas Leland had claimed under the Homestead Act 6 years prior, was in dispute. That one Edmund Hargrove, cattle baron and the most powerful man in 3 counties, believed the land to be rightfully his under a prior deed claim predating the federal filing, that she had 60 days to vacate or face legal proceedings. Sarah read it twice. Then she folded it with great care and placed it in the pocket of her apron, walked back inside, and sat down at the kitchen table for a long while without moving. Thomas had been dead 14 months. He had died of a fever in the January of 1881, leaving behind Sarah, their 9-year-old daughter Clara, and a homestead that was finally beginning to yield something worth calling a living. They had planted winter wheat. The well had been dug deep enough to last through a dry summer. The fence line was good and the house was solid, every board of it put up by Thomas and 2 hired men from Caldwell over the course of a brutal August 2 summers back. This land was not abstract to Sarah. It was her husband's hands. It was her daughter's future. It was the only thing she had left that she could point to and say, "This is ours." She would not leave it. The first person in Caldwell she went to see was a lawyer by the name of Albert Cross, who had a small office above the dry goods store on Main Street and a reputation for being fair-minded if not particularly bold. He was a thin, gray-haired man with spectacles perched low on his nose, and he listened to Sarah's account with his hands folded on the desk in front of him. "Hargrove's a powerful man," he said when she had finished. "I know that," Sarah said. "I'm asking you what the law says, not what's convenient." Albert Cross looked at her for a moment over his spectacles. "The law says that a valid Homestead Act filing, properly executed and maintained, supersedes a prior deed claim unless that prior deed can be verified as legitimate and predating the federal survey. The question is whether Hargrove has such a deed. And if he does, then you'd have a fight on your hands. And if he doesn't, then you'd still have a fight on your hands," Cross said, not unkindly. "Hargrove has 2 lawyers from Wichita on retainer and a judge in Rooks County who owes him more than one favor. He doesn't need a legitimate deed to cause you considerable trouble." Sarah set her jaw. "Can you help me?" Albert Cross was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll look into it. But Mrs. Leland, you should know, if this goes to a proper hearing, you'll need more than just your filing papers. You'll need evidence, something that shows the sequence of ownership clearly and without question." It was while she was leaving Cross's office that she passed, on the staircase, a man coming up from the street below. He was tall and lean with the particular ease of movement that belonged to men who had spent years in the saddle, not loose or careless, but unhurried, as if his body had simply made its peace with the world's dimensions. He had dark eyes and a jaw shadowed with 3 or 4 days of growth, and he wore the trail-worn clothes of a working cowboy, a wide-brimmed hat turned in his hands as he moved past her on the stairs. He glanced at her. She glanced at him. Neither said anything. She thought nothing of it and walked out into the bright spring afternoon. His name was Jasper Reed. He was 28 years old and had come to Caldwell from a cattle drive out of Texas, looking for the next available work before the summer drives began in earnest. He had a horse named Governor, a bedroll, a carbine that he rarely used, and a general preference for straightforwardness that had cost him more than one job over the years. He was the kind of man who told people what he thought when they asked, and sometimes when they didn't, and who would ride 20 miles out of his way to do something right rather than 10 miles the easy direction to do something half right. He was in Albert Cross's office because he was owed 3 weeks of unpaid wages by a rancher named Dooley, who had hired him for the winter, and then conveniently claimed he couldn't remember agreeing to the terms. Jasper had a written agreement in his shirt pocket and intended to use it. He did not think much about the woman on the stairs, not immediately, but he remembered her face, the directness of her eyes, the particular kind of set to her expression that was not hardness exactly but something adjacent to it, the look of a person holding themselves very still because they cannot afford to come undone. He would see her again 4 days later, and that was when everything began. The occasion was the town meeting held at the Caldwell courthouse regarding the proposed extension of Hargrove's grazing rights across the eastern range. These meetings were, in the main, formalities. Hargrove had enough influence with the county commissioners that the outcomes were rarely in doubt, but the ranchers and homesteaders attended anyway, because not attending felt like surrendering before the fight had started. Sarah came with a folder of papers under her arm and sat in the third row. Jasper came because the man who currently employed him, a small rancher named Pete Cavanaugh, had asked him to come along and listen. Jasper sat at the back, his hat on his knee, and watched. Hargrove's man spoke first, a sleek, well-dressed fellow from Wichita named Hollies who smiled too much and used legal language the way some people use smoke, to obscure rather than illuminate. He laid out the case for expanded grazing rights with practiced smoothness, citing range usage statistics and beef prices and the economic benefit to the broader county. Then the commissioner asked if anyone wished to speak against. There was a long silence of the kind that exists when people are afraid. Sarah Leland stood up. She was not a large woman, and she had not dressed for any kind of performance. She wore her good wool dress and her hair up, and she held her folder of papers in front of her with both hands. But when she spoke, her voice was clear and carried to every corner of the room. Expanded grazing rights on the eastern range would push water access away from every homestead claim between here and the county line, she said. I have 3 letters here from neighboring homesteaders who could not attend today, but who asked me to speak on their behalf. These are their words, not mine, and they are telling this commission that they cannot survive another season if Hargrove's cattle are allowed to overgraze the creek land to the south. This isn't about cattle prices. This is about whether ordinary families can continue to farm the land they filed on lawfully. I would ask the commission to read these letters before it votes. She walked forward and placed the letters on the table in front of the commissioners. There was a murmur in the room. Hargrove's man Hollies watched her with an expression of careful neutrality that barely covered his irritation. One of the commissioners, a heavy-set man named Pratt, looked at the letters, looked at Sarah, and said, "We appreciate you coming forward, Mrs. Leland," Sarah said. "Sarah Leland. My husband Thomas filed on 160 acres 6 miles east of here in 1876. I'd like it noted in the record that I was here and that I spoke." "Noted," Pratt said. She sat back down. The commission voted 3-2 to table the expansion for further review, which was not a victory exactly but was something, and the room exhaled. Jasper had watched her the whole time from the back of the room. He could not have said precisely what it was, the steadiness of her, the way she had placed those letters on the table with such deliberate care, the absence of any performance in her voice. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply saying what was true and doing what had to be done, and doing it when no one else in that room had been willing to. He found himself outside afterward where she was standing on the courthouse steps with her now empty folder, watching Hargrove's man Hollies climb into a handsome black carriage. Jasper came to stand nearby, not intrusively but close enough to be in the same geography. "That took nerve," he said. Sarah glanced at him. She recognized him from the staircase. "It took nothing but speaking," she said. "In a room full of people who weren't going to," he said. "That's what nerve is." She looked at him more carefully then. "You were at the back, you didn't speak either." "No," he said. I work for Pete Kavanaugh, it wasn't my place. Do you believe in places? She asked, and there was genuine curiosity in it rather than criticism. Sometimes, Jasper said. Other times I think places are just what people call the spot where they stopped moving. That surprised a small, involuntary smile out of her. She pressed her lips together immediately as if she'd been caught at something. I'm Sarah Leland, she said. Jasper Reed, he said. I heard what Hargrove's been doing to your land claim. Kavanaugh mentioned it. Everyone's heard, she said. Hearing doesn't help. No, he agreed. What would help? She looked at him with an appraising expression, the kind that had nothing to do with vanity or flirtation, and everything to do with determining whether a person was worth talking to. Evidence, she said, after a moment. Letters, documents. There was a man named Whitfield who surveyed this county in 1873, 3 years before Hargrove claims his deed was drawn up. If I could find Whitfield's records, I could prove that the Eastern Range was already designated federal land at the time Hargrove supposedly acquired his deed, which would make his deed fraudulent. Where's Whitfield now? Dead, she said. But his son is living up near Dodge City. Albert Cross wrote him 3 weeks ago. We've had no answer. Jasper was quiet for a moment. The afternoon sun was long and golden, and the sound of the town went on around them, horses and wagon wheels and the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. I'm riding to Dodge City next week, he said. I can find Whitfield's son. Sarah studied him. Why would you do that? Because it seems like the right thing, he said simply. She was silent for a moment. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but became more open, the way a door can be open without being all the way unlatched. I can't pay you, she said. I have very little money. I'm not asking for pay, Jasper said. Then you're either very kind or very foolish, Sarah said. My mother always said they were closer relations than people think, he said. This time the smile came and stayed a little longer before she controlled it. She held out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and direct like the rest of her. I'll write you a letter, she said, for Whitfield's son, explaining what I need. That'd be useful, he said. They stood for a moment in the afternoon light, and the town moved around them, and something that was too quiet and too new to be named, yet settled between them like a seed dropped into good soil, uncertain of what it would become but certain of something. The next morning, Sarah rode into Caldwell and left a sealed letter at the livery stable where Jasper was keeping his horse Governor. The letter was addressed to one Daniel Whitfield of Dodge City, Kansas, and inside it explained, in Sarah's precise and careful hand, what she needed and why, and what it meant for her family, and for the other homesteaders who had been pushed to the edges of their livelihood by Edmund Hargrove's relentless expansion. She had also enclosed separately a short note for Jasper himself. It said only, "Thank you for what you are doing. I know it is not nothing whatever you say. S. Leland." He read it sitting on a hay bale with Governor watching him from the next stall over, and he read it twice, and he held it for a moment with a careful expression that no one was around to see. He left for Dodge City on a Monday, and the ride was 2 days if you pushed. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with dust on his coat and a stiffness in his lower back that he didn't let on about, and he found Daniel Whitfield through the simple expedient of asking 3 different people, where the old surveyor's family had settled, and following the increasingly specific directions, until he arrived at a modest house on the edge of town, where a man in his mid-50s with a white beard and his father's careful eyes answered the door. Daniel Whitfield had indeed received Albert Cross's letter and had been composing a response for 2 weeks, because he was not a man who responded quickly to anything. But when Jasper explained who he was and what he was carrying and who had sent him and what was at stake, Whitfield opened his door wider and said, "You'd better come in, then." What Daniel Whitfield had was something extraordinary. His father, the surveyor, had kept meticulous records, ledgers, maps, correspondence, all of it organized and preserved because the elder Whitfield had been constitutionally incapable of throwing anything away. Among those records were the original 1873 survey notes for the eastern range outside Caldwell, including a letter from the Federal Land Office in Topeka, explicitly designating the land as federal homestead territory. The letter was dated April 14, 1873. Edmund Hargrove's deed, as it had been presented to Albert Cross by Hargrove's lawyers, claimed a private acquisition date of September 1872. That was impossible if the federal designation letter was legitimate, and Daniel Whitfield had not only the letter but his father's signed survey map, which showed the same boundaries, and a copy of the correspondence sent to the land office confirming the survey's completion. "This is what you're looking for?" Whitfield asked. Jasper looked at the documents laid out on the table. "This is exactly what she's looking for," he said. "She being this Mrs. Leland." "Yes, sir." Whitfield looked at him steadily. "You're a cowboy," he said. It was not an insult, simply an observation. "Yes, sir." "What's your stake in this?" Jasper thought about it honestly. "I don't like to see people bullet off what's theirs," he said. Whitfield nodded slowly. "My father surveyed this county for 20 years, he said. He believed in doing it right. He'd have wanted these records used for something. He picked up the documents and organized them carefully, then placed them in a leather case. "Take them," he said. "Take the originals. My father's records are witness enough." Jasper accepted the leather case with both hands. "I'll see they're returned to you once the hearing's done," he said. "See that they are," Whitfield said. Then, after a pause, "and tell this Mrs. Leland that my father would have liked her." Jasper rode back to Caldwell in a day and a half, pushing Governor harder than usual because there was something alive in the leather case strapped to his saddle, and he could feel it. He arrived on a Friday evening just as the light was going amber over the flat Kansas land, and he went directly to Sarah's homestead rather than stopping in town. He had been to the homestead once before to pick up the letter, but he had not gone inside. Now he rode up the long approach and saw her in the yard, drawing water from the well with the particular economy of motion that people develop when they have done the same physical task 10,000 times. A small girl with brown hair sat on the porch steps watching him come. Clara Leland was 9 years old and had her mother's directness and her father's calm. She watched Jasper ride up without expression, evaluating him with the impartial thoroughness of a child who had learned that the world required careful looking. "Are you the cowboy?" she asked. "I'm a cowboy," Jasper said, stopping Governor near the fence. "Mama said a cowboy was going to Dodge City for her." "That be me," Jasper said. Clara considered this. "Did you get what she needed?" "I think so," Jasper said. Sarah had turned from the well and was watching him. He swung down from Governor and held up the leather case. "Daniel Whitfield sends his regards," he said, "and his father's records." Sarah set down the water bucket, walked across the yard, and took the case from him with both hands. She opened it carefully and looked at the documents inside, and Jasper watched her face as she read the careful attention, the growing comprehension, and then something that was too contained to be called relief but was in the same family. Her eyes went bright. "This is the federal designation letter," she said quietly. "Dated 1873, Jasper confirmed. 4 months after Hargrove claims his deed was executed." Sarah looked up at him. The evening light was behind her, and it caught the edge of her hair, and she was, at that moment, one of the most alive-looking people he had ever seen. Not beautiful in the conventional sense that the word was usually applied, but vivid like something that has been through fire and come out more itself rather than less. "Come inside," she said. "Clara, would you water the horse?" "Yes, Mama," Clara said, and climbed down from the porch steps with great dignity. Inside the house, which was small and clean and organized with the same precision that characterized everything about Sarah Leland, she poured coffee and spread the documents on the kitchen table and read them through completely while Jasper sat across from her. He drank his coffee and didn't interrupt. The house smelled of bread and wood smoke, and something floral from a jar of wildflowers on the windowsill that Clara had clearly put there. When Sarah finished reading, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I need to get these to Albert Cross tonight." "I'll ride with you," Jasper said. She looked at him. "You've been in the saddle for a day and a half." "I've been in the saddle longer," he said. "You should eat first," she said, and it was not a question. She was already moving to the stove. "We have stew." They ate together, the three of them, Sarah and Jasper and Clara, at the small kitchen table, and Clara talked about a mockingbird that had been singing outside her window at night and whether birds dreamed. And Jasper said he thought they probably did because they had to get the songs from somewhere. And Clara considered this with full seriousness and said that made sense. Sarah watched this exchange with an expression that was open and unguarded in a way she probably would not have allowed if she had been paying attention to herself. After supper, they rode into town. Sarah brought the documents to Albert Cross, who received them in his nightclothes and a lamp held up in the doorway, and who read the federal designation letter with visibly increasing excitement that he worked hard to keep appropriately measured. "This is substantial," he said. "Substantial enough?" Sarah asked. "If the court accepts these as authentic, and I see no reason they wouldn't, given the provenance, then Hargrove's deed claim collapses," Cross said. "His deed would have to predate a federal designation that was already on record. He would have known that. His lawyers would have known that." He looked up. "This suggests the deed may be fraudulent. Can we prove that in court?" Sarah asked. "We can try," Cross said, and this time there was something more committed in his voice. "Mrs. Leland, I'll file for a formal hearing with the circuit court in Wichita. This is strong enough." They rode back to the homestead in the dark, side by side on the road, with the Kansas sky immense and brilliant above them. The stars out here, away from town, were extraordinary thick and cold, and so numerous they seemed to crowd each other. Jasper looked up at them and thought about how large everything was and how small the particular troubles of men like Hargrove seemed against that immensity, and yet how much those particular troubles mattered to people like Sarah Leland. "Thank you," Sarah said. She was looking ahead at the road. "I don't know how to adequately express what this means." "You don't need to," Jasper said. "I feel that I do," she said. "You have no obligation to me. You barely know me. And you rode to Dodge City and back on the strength of a stranger's cause." "It wasn't a stranger's cause by the time I was riding," Jasper said. She glanced at him. In the dark with the starlight, her profile was sharp and composed. "What do you mean?" He thought about how to say it truthfully without saying too much. "Your letter," he said. "The one you wrote to Daniel Whitfield. You let me read it before I delivered it to make sure I understood the situation. I read it. And then the note you wrote for me separately." He paused. "You're not someone who writes carelessly. The way you wrote about the land, about what Thomas built, and what it means for Clara, it mattered to me. It made me want to do right by it." Sarah was silent for a moment. The horses moved steadily on the dark road and the night was warm and wide. "I didn't write it to move anyone," she said. "I wrote it because it was true." "I know," Jasper said. "That's why it worked." They reached her gate and he helped her down from the saddle, a brief and practical gesture, but his hands were around her waist for a moment and neither of them made anything of it directly, though something passed between them that was not nothing. "Will you still be in Caldwell?" she asked. "When the hearing is scheduled?" "I'll be here," he said. It was a simple statement, but it was also a promise of a kind, and they both heard it as such. He rode back to Pete Kavanaugh's place and lay on his bedroll in the bunkhouse listening to the night sounds and thinking about a woman who wrote letters that made him want to do right by the world, and did not sleep for quite a while. The weeks that followed were busy ones. Albert Cross filed for the circuit court hearing and received a date in late June, nearly 6 weeks away. Hargrove's lawyers, a pair of sharp-suited men named Dunbar and Fitch who came up from Wichita on the train, immediately began maneuvering. They filed challenges to the authenticity of the Whitfield documents. They attempted to have the hearing location moved to Rooks County, where their judge had influence. They sent a man to visit Daniel Whitfield, presumably to pressure him, but Whitfield, who turned out to have a backbone considerably sturdier than his mild exterior suggested, sent the man away with a sharp word, and immediately wrote a letter to Albert Cross informing him of what had happened. That letter, too, came to Sarah, who came to read it at Cross's office one morning in mid-May and found Jasper in the waiting room when she arrived. He had taken to appearing at useful moments, not intrusively, but reliably, the way a fence post appears where it's needed and you can't quite remember deciding to put it there. He had been helping Cross's clerk organize the paperwork, he said. Cross's clerk, a young man named Terrence who was clearly overwhelmed by the sudden complexity of the case, had not objected. "You're still here," Sarah said. It was a statement, not a question, and it was not unwelcoming. "I said I would be," Jasper said. She sat down beside him and read Whitfield's letter. When she finished, she folded it and held it in her lap for a moment. "Hargrove sent someone to pressure him," she said. "Whitfield didn't bend," Jasper said. "No," she said, "he didn't." A pause. "He's a good man. He said his father would have liked you," Jasper reminded her. She glanced at him. "You told me that already." "I know. I just think it's worth remembering when things feel difficult." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. There was something she was working out, some internal calculation that he could see in the slight movement of her eyes. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked. Not unkindly, but with genuine curiosity, the same real curiosity she had shown on the courthouse steps when she asked whether he believed in places. "Because you're right and he's wrong," Jasper said. "And because he stopped." "Because what?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because I would like to keep being useful to you," he said carefully, "if you'll have it." The color in her face shifted slightly. Looked down at the letter in her lap. "I'm not in a position to offer much," she said quietly. "I want to be honest with you." "I know that," Jasper said. "I'm not asking for anything." "You are a little," she said, not unkindly, "but I appreciate that you haven't pushed." "I won't," he said. "I just want you to know I'm here." She nodded slowly. Then very quietly she said, "Thomas has been gone a little over a year." "I know," Jasper said. "Some days it still feels like yesterday," she said. "And some days it feels much longer. I'm not sure what that means about me." "I think it means grief doesn't run on a schedule," Jasper said, "and neither does anything else." She looked at him again. That open, unguarded expression came back for a moment. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "Something simpler, maybe. Most people are simpler." He smiled at that, a real smile, a slow one. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It was one," she said. The days lengthened toward summer. Jasper rode out to Sarah's homestead 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with news from Cross's office, and sometimes without particular reason. To fix a section of fence that had come down in a spring storm, to help Clara with a wheel on the small wagon that had gone loose, to sit on the porch in the evening and drink coffee, while the light went down across the flat land, and the mockingbird Clara had told him about sang its complex borrowed songs into the darkening air. Clara had decided, with the definitive judgment of childhood, that Jasper was acceptable. She asked him questions with the same directness her mother employed about cattle and horses, and whether he had ever been to Texas, which she pronounced as if it were a foreign country of doubtful reputation. He answered her honestly and took her seriously, and she repaid this with a warm and measured approval that pleased him considerably. Sarah watched them together on the porch one evening, Clara explaining to Jasper with great seriousness how the mockingbird had 3 different songs it alternated between, and Jasper listening with genuine attention. And she felt something in her chest that was tender and frightening and new. She pressed it down carefully and went back to her mending, but it would not entirely stay pressed. One evening in late May, when Clara had gone to bed and they were sitting on the porch with the remnants of coffee going cold in their cups, Sarah said, without looking at him, "I have been thinking about what you said, about being here." Jasper was quiet, waiting. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am glad you are. I want you to know that." "I'm glad too," he said. She turned to look at him then, and the porch light caught her face, the particular kind of tired that comes from carrying things for a long time. But underneath, it's something warm and alive and present. "I'm not ready to say anything more than that," she said, "but I wanted you to know that much." "That's enough," Jasper said, "more than enough." They sat in the soft dark for a while longer without speaking, the night sounds around them, the distant train somewhere east. Neither of them moved closer. Neither moved away. The formal hearing was set for June 18, 1882, at the Circuit Courthouse in Wichita. Sarah and Albert Cross traveled down on the train. It was a 3-hour ride, and Jasper rode governor alongside the train route, arriving in Wichita in the late afternoon of the day before. He did not explain to anyone why he was not taking the train. The truth was that the horse needed the exercise, and he needed the time to think. Wichita in 1882 was a city in the process of becoming a city. The cattle trade that had defined it for a decade was shifting west with the railroad, and the town was in transition, the rough edges of its frontier days giving way to brick buildings and a more permanent ambition. The courthouse was a solid stone building on the main street, and the courtroom on the second floor had high ceilings and a dignity that impressed Sarah when she walked in to review the setup with Cross the evening before the hearing. "It's a real court," she said, and then immediately looked embarrassed to have said it out loud. "Did you expect otherwise?" Cross asked. "I expected Hargrove to have found a way around it," she said. "He tried," Cross reminded her. "He didn't manage it. The circuit judge, Judge Elias Worthy, has a reputation for being genuinely impartial. He's not one of Hargrove's men." Sarah let out a slow breath. "All right," she said. Jasper met them for dinner that evening at the hotel where Cross had arranged rooms. He had cleaned up after the ride, new shirt, face shaved clean for the first time in a while, and Sarah noticed this without remarking on it, but her eyes moved over him briefly in a way she didn't entirely control. "How are you feeling?" he asked her. "Nervous," she said with the honesty that characterized everything about her. "I have been in that land commissioner's meeting and I have been to Albert's office 100 times, but a proper courtroom is different." "You'll be fine," Jasper said. "You know this case better than anyone." "I know my case," she said. "Hargrove's lawyers know the language of courts. That's different." "Cross knows that language," Jasper said. "That's what he's there for. Your job is what it was at the commission meeting, to make sure what's true is clearly said." She looked at him across the dinner table. "You're good at that," she said, "clarifying things." "I've been told I oversimplify," he said. "No," she said. "There's a difference between oversimplifying and cutting through the unnecessary. You do the second one." Clara had stayed in Caldwell with a neighbor, a kind widow named Mrs. Poole, who Clara did not precisely like but tolerated, and Sarah had written her a letter before leaving, explaining where she was going and why, and promising to tell her everything when she returned. She did this because she believed children deserved to know what was happening in their own lives, even difficult things. Jasper had seen the letter on the kitchen table before it was sealed, and had read the first 2 lines before realizing it was private and looked away. But those 2 lines had told him everything. She was the kind of mother who did not protect her daughter from the reality of things but who helped her understand it. He thought about Thomas Leland sometimes in a complicated way. He had never known the man, but in Sarah's house, Thomas was present in the work he had done, the solid boards of the house, the deep well, the fence line run true. He was present in Clara's face, which had something in it that was clearly not Sarah. And he was present in Sarah herself, in the shape of what she was carrying and the reasons she was fighting. Jasper did not feel competitive with a dead man. He felt, if anything, a kind of respect for someone who had built something real and left it in the hands of a woman who would fight for it with everything she had. The morning of the hearing was bright and hot, the Kansas summer beginning to assert itself. Sarah wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that was too warm for the weather but which was the most dignified thing she owned, and carried the leather case with Whitfield's documents and a folder of her own letters and papers. She walked into the Wichita courthouse with Albert Cross on one side and Jasper a half step behind. Edmund Hargrove was already there when they arrived. He was a large, florid man in his late 50s, with the kind of prosperous weight that comes from decades of good living at other people's expense. He had 2 lawyers beside him, and 3 men at the back of the room who worked for him, and whose presence was clearly meant to be intimidating. He glanced at Sarah when she came in with the flat, assessing look of a man who has never considered that a woman might be his genuine equal in any situation, and then looked away with a dismissiveness that made Jasper's jaw tighten. But he said nothing. He sat down beside Sarah at the respondent's table and put his hat on his knee and waited. Judge Elias Worthy was a compact man of about 60, with a neatly trimmed white beard and an expression of thorough unimpressibility. He entered the room without ceremony, took his seat at the bench, and looked out over the parties present with the calm of a man who had seen everything and been surprised by very little. "Hargrove Land and Cattle Company versus Leland Homestead Claim," he said. "We're here to determine the validity of competing land claims on the Eastern Range, Sumner County. Mr. Dunbar, you'll represent the Hargrove claim. Mr. Cross, you'll represent Mrs. Leland. Both parties have filed their preliminary materials. Let's proceed." Dunbar went first. He was a polished speaker, and he made Hargrove's case with considerable skill: the prior deed, the claim of continuous intention to develop the land, the argument that the federal homestead filing had been made on land already privately claimed. He produced a document he described as the 1872 deed, handsomely bound and notarized, and submitted it to the court with confidence. Then Albert Cross stood up, and Sarah sat very still and breathed slowly and listened. Cross was not a polished speaker, but he was a thorough one. He walked Judge Worthy through the sequence of events methodically: the Homestead Act filing, the maintenance of the claim, the letter Hargrove had sent Sarah threatening legal proceedings. Then he arrived at the Whitfield documents. "Your Honor," Cross said, "the respondent's position is that the Hargrove deed, whatever its appearance, cannot be legitimate, and we have evidence that supports this position." He placed the federal designation letter before the court, the letter from the Federal Land Office in Topeka, dated April 14, 1873, explicitly designating the Eastern Range as federal homestead territory. This letter predates any private development activity in this area and postdates the period in which Hargrove's deed was supposedly executed. But more importantly, Your Honor, I would draw the court's attention to the accompanying survey records, the original survey of this parcel, completed by federal surveyor James Whitfield in 1873. The survey confirms the federal designation. And I have here, he produced a second document, a copy of the correspondence between the Land Office and the Whitfield Survey Party, establishing the chain of records that confirms the federal status of this land as of 1873. He paused. "The Hargrove deed claims acquisition in September of 1872. But the federal survey conducted the following year makes no mention of any prior private claim. Federal surveyors were required to note any existing private claims on the land they mapped. None was noted. Either Hargrove's deed is backdated, Your Honor, or it was created after the fact. In either case, it cannot stand against a valid homestead filing." Dunbar objected. He challenged the authenticity of the Whitfield records. Cross responded by producing Daniel Whitfield's signed affidavit, attesting to the provenance of his father's records and the chain of custody. He also produced the letter Whitfield had written to Cross after Hargrove's man had come to pressure him. Evidence, Cross argued, of Hargrove's consciousness of the weakness of his own claim. Worthy listened to all of it. He asked questions, sharp, pointed questions that cut through the eloquence on both sides and went directly to the documentary evidence. He spent considerable time with both the alleged Hargrove deed and the Whitfield federal designation letter, examining them side by side. And then he looked at Sarah. "Mrs. Leland," he said, "I've reviewed your original homestead filing. It was made in proper form in 1876. You've maintained the claim according to law." Sarah stood. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "My husband and I worked this land from 1876 until his death in January of last year. I have continued to work it since then. You have a child living with you on the claim." "Yes, Your Honor, my daughter Clara, who is 9, Worthy nodded. He looked at the documents again. He looked at Hargrove, who sat with his lawyers in a posture of expensive confidence, and then he made his ruling. The court finds that the Hargrove deed, as presented, cannot be reconciled with the federal documentary record, Worthy said. The federal designation letter and the accompanying survey records, which I find to be authentic, establish the status of this land as federal homestead territory from 1873 onward. A private deed purporting to predate these federal records, with no contemporaneous acknowledgement in the federal survey, cannot be accepted as valid. Furthermore, the respondent's evidence suggests a pattern of behavior from the claimant that causes this court additional concern regarding the deed's origins. He set the papers down. The Hargrove claim is denied. The Leland homestead filing stands, in its entirety, as the valid and exclusive claim to the land in question. This court further finds that Mrs. Leland is entitled to retain full possession of her homestead without further interference from the Hargrove Land and Cattle Company or its agents. Should any such interference occur, it will be treated as contempt of this court's order. He brought down his gavel. The room was very still for a moment. Then Sarah sat down, and her hands, which had been perfectly steady throughout the entire proceeding, began to tremble slightly in her lap. She looked at them with a kind of distant surprise, as if they belonged to someone else. Jasper reached across and put his hand over both of hers, briefly. She turned her hands and pressed his once, hard. He felt the strength and the relief in that press, and then she let go and straightened up and turned to speak to Albert Cross, who was wearing the careful expression of a man who has just won something he wasn't entirely sure he would win. At the back of the room, Edmund Hargrove rose from his chair with the slow deliberateness of a large man who has suffered a significant blow and is not yet certain what to do with it. His lawyers were speaking to him in low voices. He looked at Sarah once, a long, flat look, and then walked out of the courtroom without speaking. Jasper watched him go. Good, he thought. Outside the courthouse, in the bright midday heat of Wichita, Albert Cross permitted himself a genuine smile and shook Sarah's hand with both of his. "That's a remarkable result, Mrs. Leland," he said. "I'll be honest, there were moments I wasn't sure." "Thank you, Albert," Sarah said. Her voice was very composed, but her eyes were bright in a way that made the composure look like considerable effort. "You did beautifully in there." "The Whitfield records did beautifully," Cross said. "The credit for those belongs to someone else." He glanced at Jasper. Sarah turned to look at Jasper. He was standing in the sunlight with his hat in his hands and his dark eyes on her, and the look on his face was warm and quiet and certain. "Yes," she said, "it does." She crossed the space between them, not quickly but with deliberate intention, and she took both of his hands in hers. She looked up at him. He was half a head taller than her, and she said, "Jasper Reed, I do not have adequate words." "You don't need them," he said. "I told you that." "I need them anyway," she said. "You rode to Dodge City and back on the strength of a letter. You've spent 2 months standing beside me through all of this. You were in that courtroom this morning, and your being there mattered more to me than I know how to explain." She paused. "I told you I wasn't ready to say more than that I was glad you were here. I think I might be ready now." Jasper looked at her. The afternoon sun was fierce and the street was busy, and Wichita moved around them with complete indifference, and none of it mattered in the slightest. "Say it then," he said quietly. "I think I am falling in love with you," Sarah said, "and I think that frightens me, and I think I'm going to do it anyway." He smiled then, a full, slow smile that changed his whole face. "I've been in love with you," he said, "since you put those letters on the commission table and looked at that man Holly's like he was something you'd found on the bottom of your shoe." A laugh came out of her, a real one, surprised and warm. She pressed her lips together immediately and then gave up and laughed again, and it was the most alive sound he had ever heard. "That's when," she said. "That's when," he confirmed. She squeezed his hands. He squeezed back. And then, because there was a clerk from Cross's office watching with open curiosity from the courthouse steps, they both regained their dignity and stepped apart. though her hand remained in his for a moment longer before they let go. They took the train back to Caldwell that evening. Albert Cross fell asleep in his seat within 20 minutes of departure, his hat over his face and the slight rattling of the car as a lullaby. Sarah and Jasper sat across from each other at the window, watching the Kansas landscape run past in the late afternoon gold. "What will you do now?" she asked. "About work. You've been at Kavanaugh's ranch, but you've been helping me for 2 months. "Kavanaugh's been patient," Jasper said. "Though I suspect his patience runs partly on the same principle as yours did. He doesn't like Hargrove any more than the next man. Hargrove's grazing expansion would have hurt his operation too. So it was good for him as well," Sarah said. "It was right," Jasper said simply. "That's what mattered." She looked at him. "What do you want?" she asked. "In general, for yourself." He thought about it honestly. "I've been a trail cowboy for 10 years, he said. "I don't regret it, but I'm old enough to know that what I want is something that doesn't move around, something I come back to." He paused. "Or someone." Sarah was quiet for a moment. The train rattled on. "My homestead needs a great deal of work," she said carefully. "Thomas was going to put up a second structure, a proper barn. The lean-to we have now barely manages." "I noticed," Jasper said. "I couldn't pay you fairly," she said. "I'm not proposing an employment arrangement," he said. She met his eyes. "No," she said. "I know what you're proposing." "Too soon?" he asked. She considered him. In the train window behind him, the Kansas sky was burning orange and pink as the sun went down, and the light fell across his face and showed her a man who was patient and direct and steadfast in a way that felt, after the past 14 months of carrying everything alone, like something she had almost forgotten was possible to lean against. "Not too soon," she said. "Ask me properly. When we're home." He nodded, and the smile he kept back was visible anyway around the edges. They arrived in Caldwell as the last light was leaving the sky. Sarah went to collect Clara from Mrs. Poole's house, and Clara received the news of the court victory with the focused attention of someone receiving a military briefing, and then hugged her mother with a fierceness that made Sarah close her eyes and hold on. "Is Mr. Reed coming for supper?" Clara asked when she pulled back. Sarah looked at her daughter. "Where did that come from?" "He's been coming for supper a lot," Clara said, with the devastating practicality of the 9-year-old. "I'll ask him," Sarah said. "He came for supper." Clara made biscuits. She had apparently been practicing with Mrs. Poole, who was a good cook if not a particularly warm person, and they ate together at the small kitchen table with the lamp lit, and the mockingbird outside the window singing its nighttime songs. Sarah had put together a proper meal with the last of the smoked ham and some potatoes from the cellar, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of good food, and the evening felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something whole. After Clara was in bed, they sat on the porch. The night was soft and the stars were out in their Kansas abundance, and the land stretched away dark and enormous on all sides, and it was theirs. It was Sarah's, properly and legally and irrevocably, confirmed today by a circuit court judge in Wichita, and that fact sat in the air between them like something solid. "You said ask you properly," Jasper said. "I did," Sarah said. He turned to look at her. He had thought about what to say and had decided in the end to say only what was true. "I can't promise you easy," he said. "I don't have a fortune. I've got a good horse and an honest character and 10 years of knowing how to work hard. I know this land. I know how to fix what's broken on a homestead and how to grow things, and I know that I would be good to you and to Clara for every year I'm given. And I love you, Sarah. I love how you think and how you fight and how you write a letter and how you listen to a little girl talk about birds like it's the most important conversation of the day. I love all of that. So if you'll have me, yes," she said. He stopped. "I wasn't finished." "I know," she said. "Yes, anyway." He stared at her. She was smiling, that real smile that he had spent 2 months trying to coax into existence, and which was now sitting on her face as naturally as anything, lit by starlight, aimed at him. He reached out and took her face in both hands very gently and kissed her. She kissed him back with her hands coming up to his forearms and holding there, and it was unhurried and certain and warm, and the mockingbird kept singing and the stars kept burning and the land that was hers stretched out all around them in the dark. When they separated, she pressed her forehead against his. "I love you too," she said quietly. "I think I have for a while. I was just afraid." "I know," he said. "Are you afraid?" She asked. "Of you, a little," he admitted, "in the best way." She laughed again, that surprised, warm laugh, and he thought he would spend the rest of his life trying to make that sound happen. The weeks that followed were full of practical things, the logistical machinery of a life being rebuilt rather than simply maintained. Jasper spoke to Pete Kavanaugh, who was disappointed to lose a good hand but who shook his hand with genuine warmth and wished him well. He arranged to bring his small collection of belongings, which amounted to a bedroll, a trunk of clothes, his carbine, his saddle, and a small collection of books that surprised Sarah considerably when she saw them, to the homestead. Clara was informed of the engagement by Sarah in a private conversation that Jasper was not present for, and from which Clara emerged looking thoughtful in the way she always looked when processing important information. Later that day, she found Jasper repairing the fence on the west side of the property and stood near him for a while without speaking. He continued working and waited. "Are you going to be here all the time?" Clara asked. "Yes," he said. "Do you know how to help with arithmetic?" she asked. "I'm not very good at long division." "I can try," he said. "I'm not the quickest at it, but I'm careful." She considered this. "All right," she said, in a tone that suggested she was granting him something considerable, and went back to the house. Jasper smiled at the fence post he was driving and kept working. They were married in September of 1882, on a Saturday morning, by the minister of the small Caldwell Methodist Church. It was a simple ceremony. There were not many guests, because Sarah's family was back in Missouri and Jasper's was in Texas, and the short notice had not allowed for travel. But Pete Kavanaugh was there, and Albert Cross was there, looking pleased with himself, and Mrs. Poole was there in a good dress, looking as if she had decided to approve of things, which was apparently the closest she came to warmth. And Clara was there, in a white dress that Sarah had stayed up 3 nights sewing, standing beside her mother with enormous dignity and an expression that was fiercely tender. Sarah wore the blue wool dress, the same one from the Wichita courthouse, because it was her best. Jasper wore a new shirt that he had bought in Caldwell the day before, dark blue, which Clara had approved with a single nod. He stood at the front of the church and watched Sarah walk toward him, and the look on his face was the kind that people in that congregation remembered and talked about afterward. The minister spoke about the foundation of good things being built on truth and steadfastness, and it seemed exactly right for who they were. When it came to the vows, Jasper said his slowly and clearly, as if each word mattered individually, which they did. Sarah said hers with the same directness she brought to everything, looking at him the whole time, her eyes bright and sure. Afterward, outside the church in the warm September morning, Clara took both of their hands and stood between them on the steps for the moment it took Pete Kavanaugh to sketch a rough likeness of them in his notebook. He had a talent for drawing that he rarely mentioned, and the three of them stood in the light of that morning as something that was now entirely, officially, and with full legal standing, a family. The autumn was a good one. Jasper began work on the barn, almost immediately proper plans drawn up with Albert Cross's help and lumber brought in from the mill in Caldwell, over 3 separate wagon trips. He knew carpentry the way he knew most things, thoroughly if not fancy, and by November the main frame was up and the roof on. Clara helped hand tools and fetch water, and provide a running commentary on the construction process that was sometimes helpful and always entertaining. Sarah wrote to her sister in Missouri, a woman named Eliza who had the same directness as Sarah but expressed it more loudly, explaining everything that had happened over the past year: Thomas's death, Hargrove's threat, the court case, and Jasper. Eliza's response took 3 weeks to arrive and was 8 pages long, and Sarah laughed her way through most of it. "She approves," Jasper asked, watching her read. She says, and I'm quoting, that any man who will ride 2 days to Dodge City for the right reasons without being asked twice is the kind of man worth keeping, Sarah said. Your sister sounds like a sensible woman, Jasper said. She's an extremely exhausting woman, Sarah said with enormous fondness. You'll like her. Edmund Hargrove did not disappear entirely from their lives. He was still the largest cattle operation in the county, and would be for years. But after the Wichita ruling and Worthy's explicit warning about contempt of court, he kept his distance from the Leland homestead. His lawyers had apparently advised him that the cost of further legal action was unlikely to be worth the benefit, and Hargrove was, above all else, a man who understood cost calculations. There were still the smaller indignities of proximity. His cattle occasionally pushed against the fence line, and once a man who worked for him was found cutting fence wire on the south side of the property. Jasper found the man himself on an early morning ride and had a conversation with him that was brief and very clear, after which the man left and the fence cutting did not recur. Jasper never told Sarah exactly what he said in that conversation, and she never pressed him on it, because she could read the outcome from the results. The winter of 1882 was a harsh one by Kansas standards, with 2 significant snow events in January that kept them mostly housebound for days at a time. They were not unpleasant days. The house was warm and the larder was stocked. Jasper had been rigorous about the autumn preparations, the wood laid in and the root cellar full, and they spent the long evenings reading and talking and playing card games with Clara, who was a ferocious and competitive card player who had no mercy for either of her parents. One evening in February, with the snow pressing against the windows and the fire warm, Clara in bed and the 2 of them sitting near the stove with the lamp burning low, Sarah said, "I want to tell you something." Jasper looked up from the almanac he was reading. "All right. I'm going to have a baby," she said. He stared at her. She was watching him with that careful, open expression that she used when she wasn't certain of the outcome. He put down the almanac. He stood up. He crossed to her and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth, and when he pulled back his eyes were bright. "When?" he asked. "August, I think," she said. "August," he repeated, as if the month had become suddenly important. He sat back down beside her close. He took her hand. "How do you feel?" "Well," she said. "A little tired, but well." "You'll tell me if you need anything," he said. "You'll know before I tell you," she said. "You always do." He sat with that for a moment, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the fire burned warm and the snow moved against the windows, and everything was exactly as it should be. Spring came again, as it always does. The wheat came up green and good, the best it had been since Thomas had first planted it. Jasper had added 20 acres of corn. The soil on the east side of the property was better suited to it, and a kitchen garden that was Clara's particular domain, though she would not have admitted to enjoying it quite so openly as she did. The barn was finished and housed Governor and 2 additional horses they had acquired, along with a pair of milk cows that Clara had named Margaret and Henrietta with complete seriousness. In April, a letter arrived from Daniel Whitfield, who had heard through some circuitous route that the court case had been resolved in Sarah's favor. He wrote briefly and well, expressing his satisfaction at the outcome, and noting that his father's records had been exactly what he always said they were, meticulous and reliable, and that he was glad they had been put to a good use. He also wrote, with a dry humor that surprised Sarah, that the man Hargrove had sent to pressure him had turned out to be something of a help, as it had convinced Whitfield beyond any remaining doubt that Hargrove's deed was fraudulent, which had resolved his last hesitation about providing the documents. Sarah wrote back a warm and full reply and enclosed a letter from Jasper as well, returning the formal thanks he had never quite given for the loan of the documents and the trust it represented. "You didn't have to write a separate letter," Sarah said, when she saw him adding it to her envelope. "Yes, I did," Jasper said simply. She sealed the envelope and handed it to him. He rode it into Caldwell to the post office, and on the way back stopped at Cross's office to drop off a signed agreement regarding the western boundary line, a small legal matter Cross had been helping them navigate, and found Cross in high spirits because he had, the day before, won a case against a neighboring county land assessor that he had been working on for 2 years. "Things are turning in the right direction," Cross said. "I believe this county is becoming a place where the law means something." Jasper thought about Sarah standing up at the commission meeting with her folder of papers and her clear voice. He thought about the Whitfield documents spread on Cross's table. He thought about Judge Worthy's gavel coming down. "I think it's becoming that," he agreed. Clara finished the school year in June with notably improved arithmetic scores, which she attributed partly to her own superior effort and partly, with grudging honesty, to Jasper's patient help with long division. She presented him with this information in the tone of a person bestowing a formal honor, which he received in the same spirit. Sarah watched from across the kitchen with her hands folded on her rounded belly and an expression of absolute happiness. The baby was born on the 4th of August, 1883, a Tuesday, which Clara declared a good day for important events. He was a boy large and healthy, with dark hair, and from the first minutes, a watchful attentiveness that made the midwife laugh and say she had never seen a newborn study a room so carefully. They named him Thomas James Reed Thomas for his grandfather, James for Jasper's own father who had died some years ago, and Clara approved of this with a solemnity that suggested she had given it extensive prior consideration. Jasper held him that first evening, sitting in the chair by the window with the August sunset coming in, and the smallness and completeness of the child in his arms was something he had no words for. He was aware of Sarah watching him from the bed where she lay, tired and radiant, and of Clara sitting on the edge of the bed beside her mother, and of the particular extraordinary ordinary quality of the moment, 4 people in a warm room in the Kansas evening, a family that had been built piece by piece from what had come before and what was being made now. "You're going to terrify him," Sarah said. "What do you mean?" Jasper asked, looking up. "That face you're making," she said. "What face?" "The one that says you would do anything on earth for him," she said. "He's going to grow up knowing exactly how much leverage he has." Jasper looked back down at the baby. "He's 8 hours old," he said. "It starts early," Sarah said. "Clara had me completely managed by the time she was 2. "I did," Clara confirmed without shame. Jasper laughed, a full, warm laugh that filled the room, and little Thomas James opened his eyes at the sound and looked up at his father with that extraordinary watchful attention, and Jasper said quietly to no one and everyone, "All right then." The harvest that autumn was their best yet. The wheat yielded well, the corn even better, and Jasper had developed, through careful attention to Pete Cavanaugh's methods and some experiments of his own, a rotational grazing arrangement for the small herd of cattle they were building that was producing better conditioned animals than the previous year. They were not wealthy and would not be for some time, but they were more than surviving. They were building something. Albert Cross stopped by in October with a bottle of good whiskey, the finest one he had, which was not very fine by city standards, but was more than adequate for the occasion, to toast the first full year of the confirmed homestead, and to inform them that Hargrove's operation had quietly dropped 2 of its secondary land claims in the Western Range under pressure from other homesteaders who had, in the aftermath of Sarah's victory, felt emboldened to challenge them. "You started something," Cross said, sitting on the porch with his whiskey and his good humor. "I defended what was mine," Sarah said. "Yes," Cross said. "And the county watched a widow fight a cattle baron in court with nothing but letters and win. That's the kind of thing people remember." Jasper, beside Sarah on the porch, said nothing, but he thought about the leather case with the Whitfield documents and the 2-day ride to Dodge City and the letter she had written him, that careful, honest note that had said simply, "I know it is not nothing, whatever you say." and he thought about how the whole thing had come down to pieces of paper letters and surveys and federal designations and legal filings. And a woman who had understood from the beginning that truth, documented and preserved and carried forward, was the strongest thing in the world. Thomas James was 5 months old and sleeping inside, and Clara was doing her lessons at the kitchen table, and the October air was cool and clean and smelled of turned earth and the last of the season's warmth. Governor grazed in the field beyond the fence. Margaret and Henrietta, the cows, were settled in the barn Jasper had built. It was, in every way that mattered, good. One evening in the following spring, 1884, the cottonwoods budding along the creek and the first planting in the ground, Jasper found Sarah at the desk in the corner of the main room where she kept her correspondence and accounts. She was writing a letter, and he could see from across the room that she was writing it with the focused intensity she brought to things that mattered. "Who are you writing to?" he asked. "Mrs. Alderman," she said. "Helena Alderman. She's a widow over in Harper County. Her husband died last winter, and Hargrove's operation is now moving against her boundary claim." She continued writing without looking up. "She wrote to me because she heard about the case. She's asking for advice." Jasper stood in the doorway for a moment. "What are you telling her?" "I'm telling her to find the original survey records for her parcel," Sarah said, "and to hire Albert Cross if she can." And she paused in her writing. "I'm telling her that it can be done, that the law, when you have the right evidence and someone willing to carry it, is on the side of what's true." She finished the sentence she was writing and set down her pen. "She needs to know it's possible." He came across the room and put his hands on her shoulders lightly. She leaned back into him just slightly. "I could ride out to Harper County," he said. "Talk to whoever she needs talked to." Sarah tilted her head back to look up at him. "You would do that again," she said, "not a question." "Every time," he said. She took one of his hands and held it against her cheek for a moment. "I know," she said. "That's why I love you." He bent and kissed the top of her head. She finished her letter and sealed it, and he wrote it to the post office in Caldwell the next morning. The May sunrise enormous and orange over the flat land ahead of him. Governor moving with his usual easy steadiness beneath him, and the whole world opening up in front of them, both wide and full and good. Helena Alderman's situation resolved itself over the following 6 months, with Albert Cross's help, and a set of survey records that a young man in her county turned out to have been storing in his dead father's barn without knowing what they were. Jasper rode out there twice, once in early summer and once in September, and helped identify the documents and explain their significance, and the process moved more quickly because of it. The hearing was smaller than Sarah's had been, the judge less dramatic, the resolution more administrative than dramatic. But Helena kept her land. She wrote to Sarah afterward with a letter that made Sarah read it twice and then fold it and keep it in her desk, not filing it away as she did with most correspondence, but keeping it where she could find it easily. The letter said, among other things, that Mrs. Leland had given her the courage to believe that what was right could still be achieved, and that was a gift she did not know how to repay. Sarah wrote back and said there was no repayment needed, only the same offer passed along to whoever came next. Because there was always whoever came next. The West was full of people on the edges of their endurance, fighting for what was theirs against forces that had more money and more influence and more patience for legal maneuvering. The cattlemen and the land speculators and the men who believed that size and power were the only things that mattered in the world had not stopped pressing. They never entirely would. But the law, when it was used rightly, was a wall. And walls, built piece by piece from the truth, tended to hold. The autumn of 1884 brought another letter, this one from Jasper's sister in Texas, a woman named Me who wrote in the exuberant style of someone who had always had a great deal to say and not enough people paying proper attention. She was coming north for a visit, she informed them, and was bringing her husband and their 3 children, and she expected to be impressed by everything she had heard about Kansas and about Sarah Leland specifically. She arrived in October, me and her husband Franklin and the 3 children who were 7, 5, and 2, and she shook Sarah's hand on the front porch and looked at her for a long moment and then said, "I've been waiting to meet you since Jasper's first letter." "What did he say in it?" Sarah asked. "He said he'd met a woman who put letters on a table like they were the most important things in the world," me said, "and that he was going to help her keep her land. That's all he said." She glanced at Jasper with a sisterly thoroughness. I knew immediately. "That's embarrassing," Jasper said. "It's romantic," me said firmly. They stayed a week. Me and Sarah developed within the first 2 days, a friendship that was easy and direct, and seemed to require very little warming up, as if they had always been planning to know each other. Clara attached herself to me's 7-year-old daughter Polly, and they spent the week in a state of complex and serious play that consumed most of the yard and some of the barn. Thomas James, now 14 months and walking with a determination that kept everyone alert, was passed between adults like a particularly agreeable parcel. On the last evening, me and Sarah sat on the porch after supper while the men put the children to bed, and the autumn dark came down. "He's happy," me said, looking out at the dark field. "I know," Sarah said. "He wasn't before," me said. "Not unhappy exactly, but unmoored. He spent 10 years moving around and he was good at it, but it wasn't enough." She looked at Sarah. "You gave him somewhere to be." "He gave me that too," Sarah said. Me nodded as if this was the right answer. "Good," she said. They waved goodbye the next morning. Franklin and me and the 3 children piled into a wagon bound for the Caldwell train station, and Clara stood at the gate and watched them go with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has learned that good things sometimes move on. "Polly said she'd write to me," Clara said. "I hope she does," Sarah said. "She will," Clara said with certainty. "She's the kind of person who does what she says." A pause. "Like Papa." Sarah looked at her daughter, whose eyes were on the departing wagon. 9 months shy of 12 now, Clara was growing into someone fine, clear-minded, and direct and generous in the particular way of people who don't make a performance of their generosity. "Yes," Sarah said. "Like Papa." She reached out and put her arm around Clara's shoulders, and Clara leaned into her, and they stood at the gate together in the October morning, while the wagon grew small down the road. The years moved forward as years do, each one marked by the specific textures of what was grown and built and learned and loved. The homestead expanded in stages. A second acre under cultivation in 1885, a new chicken house in 1886, the first of what would eventually be a modest but reliable cattle operation by the end of the decade. Albert Cross visited regularly, less often as a lawyer now and more often as a friend, arriving with news of the county and departing with whatever Sarah's kitchen had produced that season. Pete Cavanaugh came by for the spring branding and the fall roundup and treated Jasper with the affectionate exasperation of a man watching a good employee do something better with his life. In the spring of 1887, Sarah was expecting again. This time the news came on a March morning when Clara, who was 14 now and considerably more sophisticated than her 9-year-old self would have recognized, looked at her mother across the breakfast table and said, "Are you going to tell him or should I?" Sarah stared at her daughter. "How do you know?" "Because you've been tired for a month and you've been eating crackers before bed," Clara said, "which is what you did before Thomas was born." "I was 10, I noticed." 11, Sarah said. "You were 11. Either way," Clara said. Sarah told Jasper that evening. He received the news with the same brightness as he had the first time, and the same immediate concern for how she was feeling, and the same complete reliability about everything that followed. She had learned over 5 years the particular shape of his love. It was not demonstrative in the showy way of some men, but it was thorough. It was present in every repaired fence and every letter delivered, and every long division problem worked through patiently with a small girl at the kitchen table. It was present in the way he stood beside her when she spoke at public meetings, which she still sometimes did, and in the way he listened when she talked through a problem and never once told her what to think. It was present in the way he still, 5 years in, reached for her hand across the dinner table when something had gone well, as if good things needed to be held by two people to be properly kept. Their second child was born in October of 1887, another boy lean and dark-haired like Jasper, but with Sarah's extraordinary directness of expression from the first. They named him William Will for no particular reason except that it suited him, which it did. Thomas was 4 by then, a solidly built and serious child who received his brother's arrival with the gravity of someone taking on a significant responsibility. He stood beside the cradle for a long time on the first afternoon and then turned to Jasper and said, "I'll teach him things." "What kind of things?" Jasper asked. Thomas considered. "The important ones," he said. "That sounds about right," Jasper said. Clara, at 14, was magnificent in the way of girls who have always been capable, and are now beginning to understand the scale of what that means. She helped efficiently and without complaint, and also spent a considerable amount of time that autumn bent over her schoolwork, because she had, quite recently and with complete determination, decided she intended to be a teacher. She had announced this to Sarah and Jasper on a Tuesday evening in September, as if presenting a legal brief, with her reasons organized and her timeline established. Jasper had listened to the whole thing and then said, "What do you need from us?" And Clara had exhaled slightly, as if she had been braced for argument, and said, "I need to finish school in Caldwell and then attend normal school in Topeka." Sarah had said that was entirely possible and they would arrange it. Clara had nodded, composed as always, and then gone to her room. They could hear, through the thin wall, the very quiet sound of someone who had been holding their breath for a long time finally letting it go. The decade's end brought more changes to the county. The railroad spur that had been discussed for years finally came through in 1889, opening up the cattle market considerably and bringing new settlers. Caldwell grew. New businesses appeared. The rough frontier quality of the place softened at its edges without disappearing entirely, because the land itself was still the same land, flat and enormous and subject to the full arithmetic of weather. Edmund Hargrove died in 1890 of a heart ailment at the age of 66. His operation passed to a son who turned out to have less appetite for confrontation than his father, and who settled the remaining land disputes his father had been involved in through negotiation rather than legal maneuvering. It was an undramatic conclusion to what had been, for Sarah and the other homesteaders who had fought him, a defining conflict. Sarah received the news from Albert Cross and sat quietly with it for a while. "How does that make you feel?" Jasper asked that evening. "Tired," she said honestly. "Not sad, just I spent so much time preparing to keep fighting him, and now there's nothing to fight. It's strange." "The land's still yours," Jasper said. "Yes," she said, "and that after all was the point of everything. The land was still hers." Clara went to Topeka in 1891 to attend the normal school, which was exactly the right institution for exactly the right reason, and wrote letters home that were long and detailed, and thoroughly Clara, full of observations about her professors and her fellow students, and the books she was reading, and the particular quality of Topeka in winter versus Kansas in winter generally. She also, in her second year, mentioned in passing a fellow student named George Hartwell who was studying to be an engineer, and mentioned him again in the third letter, and then fairly frequently after that. Sarah read these mentions to Jasper with a raised eyebrow. He said he'd reserve judgment until he met the man. George Hartwell appeared in person in the summer of 1892, when Clara brought him home for a week, and proved to be a quiet, thoughtful person with serious eyes and a genuine gift for listening, someone who looked at Clara the way you look at something that surprises you into being better than you thought you were capable of. Jasper shook his hand on the front porch and met his eyes and thought, good enough. Thomas, at 9, interrogated George Hartwell about engineering with the focused persistence of someone who intends to understand everything. George answered all his questions fully, and then asked Thomas what else he wanted to know, which cemented Thomas's approval immediately. Will, at 5, sat under the kitchen table during the first dinner, and observed everything from there with the particular strategic advantage of being below adult sightlines, and reported to Thomas afterward in a whispered conference that the new man seemed all right. Clara and George Hartwell were engaged by the following spring, and married in the autumn of 1893 in the same Caldwell Methodist Church where Sarah and Jasper had been married 11 years before. Clara wore a dress that Sarah had helped her make ivory cotton, with a simple line that suited Clara's practical elegance perfectly. She walked down the aisle with Jasper, who had been informed 2 months prior that she would like him to walk her in, and had accepted this with a careful expression that fooled neither of them about what it meant to him. He walked her in slowly and with great care, and when he placed her hand in George Hartwell's and stepped back to stand beside Sarah, Sarah reached for his hand in the pew and held it through the whole service. The years settled into themselves after that, good years, full ones. Thomas grew tall and went to work on the homestead with a seriousness and a skill that was unmistakably his father's, and at 17 announced he intended to study law, which struck both Sarah and Jasper as so perfectly suited to him that they couldn't think why they were surprised. Will grew up quick and bright and sociable in a way that occasionally exhausted his family and delighted everyone who met him outside it, and had by the age of 12 developed such an extensive friendship network across 3 counties that the Postal Service at Caldwell occasionally remarked on the volume of his correspondence. In the summer of 1895, Sarah sat down one evening and wrote a letter. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, carefully, truthfully, without unnecessary decoration. It was a letter to a young woman she had never met, named Ruth Carey, who had written to Sarah. Sarah's name was by now known, in that quiet way that names become known when people have done something real, asking for advice about fighting a land dispute of her own, further west in Colorado Territory. The letter Sarah wrote was long. It told Ruth Carey everything: the sequence of the case, the importance of documentary evidence, the necessity of finding a good lawyer, the nature of the Whitfield records and what they had done. It told her that the law, used rightly, was the strongest tool available. It told her that she would be afraid and that the fear was appropriate but should not stop her. And it told her, at the end, that she was not alone, that there were people who had been through what she was going through and had come out the other side with what was theirs intact, and that Ruth Carey could do the same. Sarah signed it and sealed it and handed it to Jasper, who was sitting across from her at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and the Kansas summer night coming through the open window. "You're going to be famous one day," he said, looking at the addressed envelope. "I'm not doing it for fame," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." She looked at him across the table. 13 years of marriage, the lamp light on his face, the gray at his temples now, the particular weathering of a man who has spent his life outdoors and carries it well. His eyes, which had not changed at all, dark and steady and warm, and when they were on her they were entirely on her, all the way, as they had been since that first real conversation on the courthouse steps. "Jasper," she said. "What?" he asked. "I'm glad you were on that staircase," she said. He smiled, that slow, complete smile. "I'm glad you were," he said. She got up from her chair and came around the table and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him and they sat in the lamplight, while the night sounds of the homestead came through the window, the horses in the barn, the creek running south, the cottonwoods moving in the warm air, and everything was accounted for, everything was resolved, everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. Outside, the land stretched in all directions, hers, proved and documented and confirmed. 160 acres of Kansas earth that had been fought for with letters and survived, that had grown wheat and corn and children, and a life worth the name. The fence line ran true on all sides. The barn Jasper had built stood solid against the stars. The well was deep enough to last through any drought. And inside, in the back room, Will was already asleep, and upstairs Thomas was reading by candlelight with a book of legal theory that he'd borrowed from Albert Cross, and the letter to Ruth Carey sat on the table ready to be mailed in the morning, another small piece of the truth being carried forward to wherever it needed to go next. This was what they had made. Not from nothing, never from nothing, because Thomas Leland had laid the first stones of it with his hands, and that was real and always would be, but from what had been left, and from what had been found, and from what two people had built together when they chose each other clearly and without reservation on a courthouse staircase in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882. Sarah felt Jasper's arm around her and the warmth of the lamp and the rightness of all of it, and she thought that this specific evening in this specific house, with this specific person, was the kind of happiness that does not require any other thing added to it to be complete. It simply was. And it would be, for all the years that came after the wheat seasons and the dry ones, the good harvests and the difficult ones, the grandchildren who eventually arrived with their own noise and their own questions, Clara's children first, a boy and then a girl, and then in time Thomas's children, and Will's, all of it stretching forward from that single moment when a woman with a folder of letters stood up in a public meeting, because someone had to. And a cowboy in the back of the room watched her do it and understood, without being able to explain why, that he had just seen the most important thing he would ever see. He had said he would do it again. Riding to Dodge City, carrying those letters, all of it, every time, without question, and he meant it with his whole heart every day of his life.